We're back.
What's that from?
I don't think it's from something. I think it's from just the concept of returning.
The concept of returning.
Right?
We have returned to the podcast.
We have returned. We are back. What's the one from The Shining? Here's
here?
Johnny.
Here's Johnny. Yeah, that one's really
Which is a reference to, I guess,
crazy.
Johnny Carson? I'm not sure. I'm not old enough.
I don't know.
The Shining is my only reference.
You like that movie a lot, though.
It's a top 10 favorite.
It is good. It is really good.
Just relatable because it is about the two things on Earth that I find the scariest, which is winter driving conditions and writer's block.
Oh.
So it's a genuine horror movie for me. It's terrifying. I hate driving on snow.
I'd never thought about it in those terms before, but I like what you're getting at.
Thank you.
The Shining.
Thanks for coming to our movie podcast. We will not be sharing any training information, so buckle up for my play-by-play of the substance. Just kidding. Though I would recommend that. I would recommend the substance for aging female athletes, which means all female athletes, and actually really anyone. Top movie of the year for me.
Top movie. I like The Shining better than that, but we digress. We have returned from San Diego.
We're back. We went to San Diego to go for a 3-day boot camp to train for the UTMB Chianti 120K.
I like that accent. You've been working on that.
Actually, I have been taking it. My Christmas present to myself was to take Italian lessons because I went to high school in Italy. And since we're going back to Italy, I was like, I should brush up. So it would actually be the UTMB Chianti 120 chilometri.
Nice. Excellent. Remember in Argentina just how well it goes over at the aid stations when you don't know the language?
Yeah, it's not good.
To communicate with the volunteers.
Yeah, usually I just say whatever word I'm trying to say in English louder and louder and in a more stressed manner. Works every time. Eventually they're like, we just got to get this American out of the aid station. God damn it.
So we did a lot of training in preparation for this race.
We did. A lot of learning, a lot of recovering, a lot of hydrating. Oh boy. When we left Carbondale, where we live, it was 5 degrees, and it was like 70 degrees where we were training. That's a tough swing for the human body.
I had a shining moment out there as a result of that temperature swing.
Correct. Yeah.
Day one hit very hard.
Yeah, hit real hard.
Tell me about for you? Let's get into the roadmap for the conversation.
Yeah.
First, we're going to talk about boot camps.
We're going to talk about our boot camp and how to use sort of concentrated stress to get ready for any event. Doesn't have to be an ultra, though most commonly we do use it for an ultra, but theoretically you could do it for just about anything.
Yeah, and then we're going to talk a little bit about long runs, and we're going to get into a segment about training via time or training via miles.
Yeah, we're going to talk about both sides and kind of just running long today. But again, this isn't just for ultra runners. The principles that we'll be discussing here, I think, are relevant to any runner, and who knows, there might be more spicy film takes embedded in the conversation.
Could be. All right. So why do a boot camp weekend? Why not do a race? Why not do some other version of training?
Well, we had kind of tried to do a race this fall, and like every single race we've signed up for in the Bay Area, it was canceled because of a historic weather event, because every fucking time we travel to California, we are preceded and or accompanied by a historical weather event. I don't know who I pissed off in a previous life to make that happen, but I'm so sorry. Please relieve me of this curse.
We did barely make it in because of a storm. And the trails were quite muddy during Friday's run as a result. But hey, you know what? They dried up really fast.
They did.
So this was actually better weather than a normal trip for us.
That's true. I got sunburned, which I appreciate and enjoy.
I think it's important to differentiate between the stress of a race and the stress of training when you're thinking about boot camp. So I had actually thought about maybe doing another race as well.
Yeah.
Rather than doing a boot camp because I prefer racing, I guess, to training in many respects.
Yeah, it's interesting because like I had never even considered doing a race to get to, or usually for summer I sort of do a race progression, like a couple like B and C races to get ready for my A event, which is usually like a longer race at the end of the year. Weirdly, this UTMB Chianti race, which is like 74 miles, 120K, is kind of like smack dab in the middle of the spring, which is tough for us to get ready for because the trails are not open where we are. So we've been training on the road for a race with 16,000 feet of vertical gain. So that's going to be interesting. But I mean, from my perspective, I preferred the boot camp to the training just because
to racing.
Boot camp to racing because it feels a little bit more in my control and doable given my current life stress context. Like, yes, they are both stressful, but like mentally, like doing 3 days of hard training feels a little less stressful for me mentally and emotionally than like if I had done like a 50-mile race.
Totally. And I think that there's a good point. And to go one step further, racing hard a 50-mile race is going to set you back 3 or 4 weeks of training in terms of recovery.
Because you have to taper and then recover.
Right. So and I think at least for me, the way I respond to ultra stress is best case scenario, I'm starting to get back into the swing of things after 2 full weeks of recovery. Usually it takes me more like 3 or 4 weeks to really be back training at a high level. So when I talk to my coach about like, okay, race versus boot camp, it was just a much better idea to then go and do 3 easy runs that are quite long rather than having like one really flood the system with one really hard stress that then historically it takes you like a month to recover from, because in a month I'm racing this race, and so I'm going to be able to get in a lot more additional training as a result of having done the boot camp.
From my perspective, the boot camp is much more under your control. You control the training volume, you control the terrain, you control like the distance. Whereas like if you're doing a race, which sometimes can be really helpful, but then, this time of year it could be tough for us to optimize and figure out where in the United States can we fly to and have a nice time where it's like somewhat similar to the, Chianti terrain.
Right.
And so we sort of split the difference and found a place that was like fun to go to and had terrain that, dear God, I am going to have to bring up in therapy, but
probably harder than Chianti.
Ideally. If Chianti is harder than this, I'm going to be walking for 74 miles.
20-hour,
20, I'm going to be out there for 3 days. It's going to be my Cocodona.
It will be.
But I mean, all of that is to say that like there can be different, it depends. But like for me, what it really came down to is that you signed up for the race first, and then you decided to do this boot camp, and I was like, what the fuck, I'll do it too. So is that the strategy I want my athletes to adopt? Absolutely not. But I've sort of retconned my belief system into being like, oh yes, the boot camp is better because it's under our control.
Yeah.
Rather than like, I'm beholden to a race calendar somewhere else.
I think one of the, as I talked about like a couple of podcasts ago, I was quite nervous about the volume of this weekend. And originally my coach had me scheduled for about 4 more hours than I did.
Yeah.
And I was really grateful that we had a very open discussion about those training hours.
Because training is collaborative. Training is a dialogue.
Yes.
Training is not a dictatorship.
And it was good because I felt like that, one, for me psychologically, that was too much of a leap. 2, my body was not feeling very good the last month. And so I was like, to do 18 hours of training over a 3-day weekend is just, I don't know. I don't have the evidence to support that I can do that. And
so or that you need to, because you don't want to do training volume that you don't need.
Right.
To progress.
No, totally.
Because then it's just vanity miles.
It is. And I mention this only because, in something that I've been thinking about in my training recently that I think will be interesting to the audience is that where is the balance between, runs that make you feel good and boost your confidence and runs that do the opposite and really fatigue you and kind of like almost make you feel like, oh man, like am I actually progressing? Where's the balance in that? And how and where do you need to be in order to progress? Because a weekend like this, one on paper is really hard. You know, we did 14 hours of training over 3 days. Correct. Is quite a lot.
We did a 4-hour run, then a 6-hour run, and then a 4-hour run.
Right.
If I can just interject, the number one thing I learned is that running the day after flying sucks ass.
Oh, it's so bad.
And originally we had been slated to run for 6 hours the first day, like ideally to do the bulk of our volume when we were the freshest. And in my head, I'm like, oh, flying. Like, I'm basically just sitting in my chair eating Twizzlers all day. It's so relaxing. It is not. My GI system is shut down. I'm not sleeping. Like, my feet are twice the size. And so I think
we also took one additional flight.
We took an additional flight.
We missed a flight because of the delays.
Yes. Logistically, it was a nightmare. And also, like, physiologically, nothing occurred on that day to set me up for exercise success. So I'm just offering the advice that anytime you have the option to not fly before you need to exercise to your potential, do that. Give yourself a buffer day. Fly and then ideally get like at least a little shakeout run in before whatever thing is important.
Great.
Or if you are flying and then you have to do a hard day, just give yourself grace.
I love that. I'm definitely not setting athletes up with the hardest day of training. Typically on the first day of a boot camp, I usually make that the easier day. The middle day, the hardest, and the last day a little less hard than the middle day.
Yeah.
That's just my personal prescription based on what most people can do in the context of their life. Not a lot of people have the privileges that we have to take like a 4-day weekend to go do something like this. But again, back to kind of my original question that I've had in the back of my mind lately in training is this, like, how much of training should boost your confidence, how much of training should kind of put you in a position where you're questioning things. What do you think about that? Like, how often are you feeling boosted by your training confidence-wise? How often are you feeling like, oh shit, I'm going into the unknown here?
Yeah. I will say at least once per training block, I have a day where I think running is impossible. I am terrible at running. I need to pull out of this race. And at least once per training block, I will tell you, usually crying on the side of the trail, I need to not do whatever my next race is. Inevitably, I always go do the race and it's fine. So, has that prevented me from having the, like, come to Jesus moment on the side of the trail? No, it has not. But it does give me the evidence to suggest that feeling that way is okay and maybe even just a part of my fucked up process.
Right.
And I think that when you're training to your potential, again, like, I've never been like, oh, I really want to get this athlete to the point where they question all of their life decisions. That is never my intent. But if such a thing occurs where you have a day in training that makes you be like, oh my God, running is so hard. How am I ever going to run a marathon? How am I ever going to run a 50K? That's okay. That's not the intent of training, but there is space for that. I will also say that for me, confidence is a story I tell myself after the fact with whatever evidence I have. Like, I took that story about, like, literally day one of our boot camp. I was like, I hate this. I want to go home. It's muddy. I'm hot. I'm not prepared. I feel shitty. I didn't eat lunch yesterday. And I was like, I don't think I can do this race. My legs feel terrible. And then I ate a sandwich and was fine. So I think all of that is to say that now I'm taking that story and I'm using it actually as evidence that I am ready rather than as evidence that I am not ready. The circumstances identical, but I'm telling myself a more empowering story about it. And that's how confidence functions for me. I think there's also, like, some, beyond just, like, the narrativizing of it all, some, like, training specifics of, like, while I'm getting on trails, I'm trying to, like, run some vert, like, I'm doing higher volume. I'm really finding specific aspects of my training and being intentional about connecting them to a narrative of confidence. And I'm not sure if that accurately answers your question or not.
Well, no, I think that it's an interesting idea of, like, how much of the training should validate you for being prepared and how much of the training should be designed to make you prepared. And then that, I think a lot of, I think for myself, like in previous relationships with, my previous coach, I guess, a lot of the training, I just showed up and was like, fuck yeah, I killed it.
Yeah.
And a lot of the training that I've been doing over the last 8 weeks is like, holy shit, I'm destroyed.
Yeah.
And that fundamental shift, like the thing that I've noticed in myself that's missing is like, oh damn, I don't have the validation of rocking these runs anymore. Mm-hmm. That's not there.
Yeah.
I'm feeling real tired. Like the fatigue is taking over. Yes, the fatigue is what's going to make me prepared. But man, that fatigue voice is really loud. My body's not feeling very good.
Right.
Is this now a referendum on my ability to be prepared? I'm not getting that validation anymore. That's kind of affecting like my feelings around this. I guess, how much should we be going for that feeling? How much should we be leaning into just trusting like the training is meant to kind of like make you feel pretty crappy.
Yeah.
And that's what's going to produce the physiological response and the adaptation that then on race day, you get to go and feel really good and benefit from in that moment.
I think that's a challenging question to answer because I think it depends so much on the athlete context. And I think that I never intentionally am like, oh, I want to just absolutely torch this person.
No, me either.
I'm always thinking about like, I'm going to give this person the most optimal training. And I think that inevitably when that gets filtered through their actual experience, depending sort of on their life context too, their experience of it mentally, like I think a lot of times we can't, I know we like to think we can compartmentalize things, but whatever life stress you're experiencing, that's going to come through in the running. Family stuff, like whatever stories that you're bringing to the training, I think that's going to come through. And so confidence is a feeling, and I only think it's useful when you're in control of it.
Well, you're not really in control of your feelings, right? Because they're dictated by so many different things that are happening in your
You control how you respond to them.
So, like, confidence, I believe, is super flawed.
Yeah.
I think because it's so feelings based. One day you wake up, you're like, yeah, my hair looking freaking good today. I'm feeling it.
I feel like anyone that has curly hair has a very challenging relationship to this.
Right. So it's, I'm like, okay, do I want to base how I feel about a race on like my feeling today around it?
Yeah.
Or do I want to base it on the evidence that I've done the work that's going to get me prepared? And I think, something that I was noticing in the training leading up to the boot camp and then going into the boot camp was like, I don't have the evidence of really rocking these long runs to suggest like I'm in shape to do this race at the level I want to do it at. And I was definitely, I've been considering like not doing the race.
Yeah.
And
you'd had some injury stuff that was tough.
Yeah. And just
so it was less about like mental preparedness and then more like, is my ass going to explode?
Right. Just nagging piriformis issues out from, that I can't get rid of. And it's just like, then I went and did the boot camp. It's like, oh, where the hell did that issue go? Like, it wasn't even a problem, which is just so bizarre.
Yeah.
By the way, like, training is so weird sometimes.
So weird, dude. Like, during our 6-hour run, 3.5 hours in, my hip started to really hurt in a way that I was like, oh no, like, this is it. I finally incurred the injury that I inevitably deserve by trying to do hard training. Because I'm always trying to dismantle stories around my body's durability. And then I literally just sat down for like 10 seconds and stretched it, and it has never felt better. So, I don't know. I think the takeaway might just be I'm really dumb.
Well, clearly you're not that dumb because
Thank you. Wow. Ringing endorsement. Microcosm coaching. Not that dumb.
You're very intelligent, Zoe. In the beginning when I presented this question that I've been pondering around my own training that I am sure other athletes have thought about. Right. This of like how much of the training should make me feel good and how much of the training should make me feel pretty bad because it's supposed to feel bad. So, and you offered like that perspective shift of like, well, the days that I have to work through that are really hard, that fact that I can do that means I'm prepared.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great sign of your intelligence because that perspective shift is really, really powerful. That change in the narrative. But also, the inherent, I think, flaw in trying to chase too many feelings in your training.
Right.
You're putting a lot of the onus on things that are outside of your control. You were mentioning that before. A moral for me, something that like I want to try to lean into a little bit more, is just trusting like the fatigue state. And that's a more of an important part of this process.
You shared
now.
something, we're coached by the same person, shout out Cliff. Cliff told you something that you told me that I thought was really, really resonant about fitness and fatigue and how those feel different at later stages in the training block.
Yeah, maybe paraphrasing here, but he said like at a certain point in a training block, your fatigue gets so high that it covers up your fitness.
Because it's louder physically than your fitness.
Right.
Feeling a little bit tired will impact you more than the physiological adaptations you've gained that will help you like run a little bit faster up a hill.
Right. And so then, you have to learn to live in that space.
Yeah.
And then you have, adequate recovery, and you take the new gains that are made through that recovery process to then go and push yourself again to cover up all that fitness with more fatigue.
Yeah.
So that you can then recover and continue to
Yes.
work that cycle over and over again till you create growth.
Correct.
And that is definitely something that like I felt this more in this training block than I ever have in the 7 years of previous training. And that hit me pretty hard.
Because it's a really different approach. Like previously you've done lower volume. You finished like 99% of your training weeks, like easy peasy, done.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
And then with like pulses, like 1 week at higher volume, whereas now you and I have both sustained 4 to 6 weeks at a higher volume.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just really interesting to think about and building that trust in the fatigue. And that's there.
And not letting it freak you out too much.
So I don't know if you have any more remarks around the boot camp, but maybe that's a good way to segue into the long runs, which are one of these ways that we concentrate stress to provoke a lot of fatigue.
I think I have a few like rapid fire takeaways. Again, I cannot stress enough how awful plane travel is for your body. Yeah. So like plan accordingly, everyone. Pack snacks. I'm still like really shook by how crappy I felt. Like I literally told you like I'm gonna drop out of this race.
Friday was
I
a
am
tough
also
day.
a drama queen, so
yes, you are.
It's fine. Like every time I'm like I'm gonna quit running, and you're like, great job.
We should not do any runs together.
Well, that's another thing I've learned. You are my best friend, and I never want to run with you again. I'm so sorry. We're just really different. We're different people. That's fine. We're life partners. We don't need to be running partners. I love you so much, but I love listening to my own thoughts and or movie podcasts while running more. Yes. You're just quiet while you run. Like, do you think? What do you do? Like, what's happening in your head while you run?
I'm focused on executing the training at a high level and, being in the intention of the day and positive affirmations and just enjoying the experience. Like on Friday, you were like, this mud is terrible. I was like, what mud? Like my attention wasn't on the mud at all.
Yeah.
Like there was some mud for sure. But I was more like, oh, this terrain's pretty tough. Like, what? How can you stay smooth? Oh, I feel pretty good right now. That's kind of surprising. Let's ride that wave. Yeah. I don't know. I was more focused
I'm
on
so happy for
different
you.
things than you were.
Because I feel like I spend, half the time thinking of a fun Strava title and then other like random thoughts like, oh, if I wrote a screenplay, it would just be like The Taming of the Shrew, but then I would do it backwards and I would take out all the male characters.
You're just wasting a lot of energy thinking about a lot of stuff.
This is my free time. I have to let my imagination run wild. Another takeaway is that data can be really, really silly.
Oh, gosh.
There is always an inclination. Again, like something I always stress with my athletes is data is only ever a proxy for what's happening in your body. Yep. It's not a direct measurement. It, in some way, like even like heart rate variability, that's a proxy for your recovery and your ability to take on training load. It's not like a direct measurement of like, unless you're getting like a daily blood test, we don't know what your inflammation levels are.
My HRV was the lowest it's been the whole build the whole last 8 weeks on Sunday's run, and that was my best run of all 8 weeks of training.
Yeah, every day after the boot camp, my watch was like, congratulations, you need to recover for 8 weeks. And I did not do that, and I am alive.
You're here, you made it.
And I just, data is only ever a proxy. For instance, we did some very tough runs. The terrain, it was very hot out. The terrain was what I can only describe as fucked in terms of technicality. Like, truly, like, sent from hell to torment me on vacation.
It's not
levels of technicality.
It wasn't great. It was hard terrain.
It was hard. And therefore, our intensity factor, or the IF on Training Peaks, was like 4.
Mine was like 0.6.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh no.
So, we know those were obviously hard runs.
Right.
So, like, what do we trust, the data or us? Obviously, always us. But again, I think athletes tend to really, really over-index on data because it seems so sure, because it seems so sciencey. And we tend to over-focus on things that it's called measurement bias. We tend to focus on things that we can measure and things that are harder to quantify, like feeling, like fitness, confidence, those more like intangible things that are actually really fucking important. Like, I almost never look at my IF for runs unless it's hilarious or my coach is like, yo dog, you gotta slow down.
Right.
Which is 90% of his job. Shout out Cliff.
I look at my IF after every single run. I look at every single interval.
Yeah.
To make sure that I'm right where I need to be.
I trust my coach to do that.
I love that. That's probably a very healthy. I trust my relationship with the numbers.
Yes.
Is good, but
yeah.
I also have realized that there are moments like on those trails where I can judge myself based on those numbers too. Like, wow, this IF is really low. There's no way you're going to reach your goals at Chianti. You just totally blew it. You're not ready for the race. Like, I went down that path for a little bit and then had to like steer back. So, the numbers are just the numbers.
And I'm not saying they're unimportant. The context
is so important.
And I'm not saying ignore them. And I'm not saying, like, throw your watch into the ocean and run naked and free. I see time and time again athletes over-fixate on the data and over-index on it to the detriment of getting in touch with how they actually feel. And you are the most accurate measurement tool. Like, the heart rate monitor between your ears is the best equipment that money can't buy. Yeah. So that's another takeaway.
Great takeaway. I think that's one of my favorite takeaways.
Yeah. And then what was the other takeaway? DoorDash is dope as hell for when you don't want to leave your house because you ran for 6 hours.
One day there will be one restaurant in our town that delivers food.
I think you can get food from the grocery store.
Delivered?
Yeah, I think they can DoorDash groceries to you. I haven't looked into this.
Town?
Yeah.
Still, I have to make.
I'm skeptical.
Things.
Yes,
I have
exactly,
to put those
right.
ingredients together and make something.
Right, it removes like one of the easiest steps out of the process. So
going to the store is not the issue.
Not helpful. And I think another thing is like whenever I have athletes, like again, understanding that everyone's access to doing it, like traveling to a boot camp can be different. You can do that without leaving. You can do like a staycation boot camp. But the number one thing I would ask athletes to do is, to the best of their ability, guard your time, guard your recovery. You can only train as hard as you recover. And if you're trying to when you're doing a boot camp or a higher, like a big week, which we'll talk about why you should never over fixate on the big week or the big run, but do yourself a favor and treat yourself like the amazing, incredible, elite athlete you are and guard that time. Just because you're not running doesn't make it unimportant. So to the extent that you can offload some work responsibilities, can offload some family responsibilities, can call on your support networks, can call on your partner, parents, friends, like anything that you can take off your plate, I would urge you to do so because you need that space for recovery to get the most out of these opportunities as possible.
Yeah, so true. Love that message. All right, listener question. How long should your longest run be? What a question.
What a question.
My gosh.
I feel like you just turned a little bit pink just reading it. So I would say that this question is inherently flawed. This is something I always get from ultra runners. Like, how long is my longest run going to be? And I'm always like, I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Let's see how things go.
Let's see how things go. I don't have enough information yet. And I think it's because people always really think that the longest run is somehow a prerequisite for any given, particularly ultramarathon event. So it's kind of similar to, I see this with marathoners getting really attached to the 16 or the 18 mile long run. And another flaw is that people assume that the longest run builds some magical level of fitness that you can't get otherwise in training. Not true. There's also sort of an assumption that it's universal for everyone. Again, not true. Like, you and we're training for the exact same event. We have the exact same coach. You and I's longest runs were they were the same time-wise, but not like mileage and prescription wise.
They've been very different in that
They've
respect.
been very different because
time.
We are different humans, and you have more testosterone than I do, unfortunately. And so, yeah, again, I think that particularly people who are really thinking about going the longest they ever had, doing that first marathon, doing that first ultra, they get really, really over-focused on the long run. And the number one message I would like to impart to people is that the longest run in your training plan is not the most important factor for race day success. It is not the most important.
Yeah. Would you say there's any specific recommendations or...
Nope. There is literally, it's so different for everyone. It depends on the event. It depends on your volume. It depends on your training history. It depends on your sex. You know, a lot of this stuff is very different. And so there's no like magic distance. Like for, my athletes training for a 100 miler, their peak long runs gonna look very different. My athletes training for a marathon, all of their peak long runs are going to look different. There's no like threshold that you need, like as soon as you hit the, as soon as you run a 50-mile long, don't run a 50-mile long run fucking ever unless it's a race. But like, there's no like, you must be this long to ride this ride scenario for long runs.
I do think that something that is really important here is cumulative training volume.
Yes.
And that this matters a lot more than any single long run. So your weekly duration or mileage and the consistency, the amount of time you spend at those those high points in your training and those low points, you're getting the recovery, like you mentioned. Like those things are much more important overall. I don't even know if we want to get into some of these numbers that we've got in our outline here, if it's even that important.
I think that just showing the discrepancy in like some plans, when I was looking around the internet, some plans recommend 50% of race distance for the longest run. Others go as low as 20%, and I even saw 80% on one marathon training plan. So there's no universal agreement on these things, and I'm always really skeptical of any any broad strokes recommendation, and that's why I think finding a training plan and a coach and a regimen that works for you is so important.
Right? Like my running over the boot camp weekend, for example, probably if I run very well at this race, I think could be like maybe 2 hours more training volume than I'll actually do in the race itself. But for you, it might be like, 100% of the race, like duration in 3 days.
Yeah.
So it's just like, how do you really organize that? Well, you think about that more in terms of the individual, what their needs are, what helps them perform is up to the level that they want to perform at, what's going to help build their confidence versus what's going to help break them down, what's going to help them with progressive overload or a higher level of stress concentration to provoke specific adaptations. I mean, there's so much individuality in this that it's like, okay, well, if I'm running 70 miles a week, does that mean my long run should always be 20? Or if I'm running 40 miles a week, should my long run be 10? Well, it depends.
Yeah. Again, great job security for coaches. So
yeah,
pumped on that. And I think I just always want athletes to think about any training stimulus as a cost-benefit analysis. It is a stress, therefore there is a cost, but we want to weigh that with the potential benefits. So I think that it's really important to consider that there are diminishing returns on very long training runs. We've all seen elite and pro athletes logging just freaking huge, I'm doing the Nolan's route for my long run. Don't do that. Or I'm doing, all the 14ers in a day, or I'm doing a 50-mile long run. Very long runs require extended recovery. They increase your injury risk and they reduce the total training effectiveness. And so again, don't get overly caught on it. Don't get distracted by some of the truly wild shit you will see people doing.
Back-to-back long runs are a very effective alternative way
I love back-to-backs.
working with overall volume week to week and providing a race similar stress. Hence a boot camp, 3 back-to-back long runs. A boot camp could also be 2 back-to-back long runs, depends on what your availability is. But making sure that training is individualized is super important. And then always making sure that there's a balanced approach that helps to prevent burnout. So volume increases are done gradually. And we're also making sure that like athletes are well recovered going into the higher stress parts of their training builds. Listen to your body first and foremost. If a run leaves you wrecked, it might have been too long. It should probably only be a couple runs like that in a build, in my opinion.
Yeah, and you shouldn't be like, I can't get off the couch. It should be like, that was that I learned things about myself.
Yeah. Train smart by tailoring your long runs to your personal needs, guys.
Yep. And so again, like, don't like the long run, like, it's only ever going to be in the single digits of like the percentage of your training volume in any one block.
Right.
So getting overly fixated on it or feeling like you need it, I think can be really detrimental. If you had to miss a day of training, would I say that that your key long run is the best one to miss? I would not say that. But can you miss a long run and still rock your race? Absolutely.
Oh, heck yeah.
So I feel like I've like blown up on many a not blown up, but I've had some, maybe not exactly kudo inspiring long runs that resulted in great race performances. And don't overemphasize the long run. Don't get too caught up in the numbers. Preparedness is so much more about what you're able to do in the 16 to 18 weeks before your race than what you're able to achieve on any given weekend.
So speaking of the numbers, let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of training by miles versus training by time.
So I'm going to start with a personal question because you and I both switched coaches this fall. And with that, we switched from mileage-based training to time-based training. I'll be candid and say that I was initially like really nervous. Like I was nervous that my volume was going to get significantly lower. I was nervous that like I wasn't like that. I don't know, like there's still some part of my brain that really likes round numbers. And like, if I don't get my 10 miles on a Tuesday, who even am I, And I think like there was part of me that was worried it would be a really big shift. And now that I'm several months into it, I fucking love it.
You like it?
Love it. Only running for an hour rocks. One time, Debo tweeted the perfect time for like the most enjoyable time for a run is 45 minutes, and like yes, I feel that. An hour is also very pleasant.
45 is great.
45 is fucking luxurious.
No friction.
No friction. Very all fun. Type 1 fun. And I have really grown to like the training by time. I was worried it would make choosing routes harder. It hasn't. It's made making sure I have enough fuel way easier. It helps me focus more on like the quality of the route instead of trying to just get stuff done as fast as possible. I'm curious to hear, because we haven't really talked about this, how you handled that shift and if you had any feelings come up around it and how it has been for you.
Well, thanks. I appreciate the question. Well, I had already actually started to switch over a lot of my athletes, especially my ultra running and trail running athletes, over to time-based training before switching myself over. I was not switched because my coach did by miles, and that just was the way that it was at that time. But I was moving athletes over because I was seeing... One, I think that there's a lot of pros to training by time.
Right.
And I wanted my athletes to, especially athletes running on trails, to benefit from that. We'll get into those pros here in a minute.
Yeah.
But for myself in that moment, I knew, looking at my training history, I was really underserved by mileage-based training because I run a lot on the roads.
Yeah.
I run all winter, almost every run on the roads.
Yeah.
So I'm not getting nearly as much volume as I could year over year. So it's preventing progressive overload in my training. So I knew I needed to get out of that in order to continue to build fitness.
Right.
A 16-mile run on the road is different than a 16-mile run on the Mission Trails in San Diego. It's different than 16 miles on
The treadmill.
then onto Red Hill, then in Loma, where we've been training a lot. So like, how do you qualify that stress?
Right.
Well, you have to go to time. So I was really ready for it and open for it, and I think it opens up some doors. Like, you can just see I'm training way more.
Same. I was worried that my long runs weren't going to be as long for some reason. Like, I think that, again, like, just whatever mental stuff I have going on, I'm like, I need big round numbers, and turns out I don't actually need big round numbers. Now I have like a bunch of like big funky numbers. I had a
love
streak
the funky numbers.
I had a streak in training for like several months where I somehow inexplicably ran exactly 69 miles a week, which is awesome. But we call that Strava edging. But all of that is to say is I think that, like, for me, it helped me really get more in tune with the effort as opposed to just trying to bang out the mileage. For instance, when I do a recovery run, doing 1 hour recovery effort has really helped me bring down my stress, when previously I was doing like 10 miles, which for me I think is kind of like a weird gray zone run.
Totally.
Like 10 miles is, I don't think I've run, I used to run 10 miles like almost every day.
Yeah.
And I haven't run 10 miles in a very long time, because now I either run like 7 miles or 20.
Right.
And that feels way better than running 10. Because, like, now my running is much more polarized, too. Which, I mean, that's, like, on me. Like, the whole time I could have been running my runs at the appropriate level. But, to
coaches,
youth is a hell of a drug.
No, to coaches out there, you have to differentiate between the intention of each of those runs. So if you don't tell the athlete what the intention is, you're not going to get the athlete to perform the way that maybe is optimal. So, not necessarily your fault. Actually, you're quite coachable and you take direction well. So I think had you had that direction, you probably would have gone slower. But you didn't really know any better, because, like, it's also hard to apply training principles to yourself, which is why coaches should have coaches.
I have a coach.
Let's get into some of these pros and cons.
I wanted to hear, so this is something you are very passionate about. So if we're going to start, like, if I'm going to be devil's mileage advocate, what are the upsides to potentially running by mileage?
I would say, you get that goal. I ran 10 miles today. Check it off the list. Hell yeah, that makes me feel good. Like, a specific outcome goal like that, I think, could be really nice. Easy way to track progress week over week. Maybe for some athletes, could be easy to set, like, routes.
Yeah.
Perhaps there's better race specificity, like I'm running a 50K,
or a marathon.
Yeah, or I'm running a marathon, so I need to do X distances to say I'm ready to do this distance. And I think, maybe athletes who have like really established paces and use mileage structure training effectively already, this, is just like great for experienced runners.
Yeah, so maybe more road marathon oriented type training. Yeah.
And I think there's some accountability there too, maybe in hitting those mileage goals. Like, I need to run 100 miles a week to run a 100 miler. Okay, I ran 100 miles this week.
Yeah.
What would you say some cons are?
So I think the big issue with mileage-based training is that it doesn't account for effort variability. Again, running 10 miles on the road or the treadmill is really different than running 10 miles up a 14er. How do you account for that in training? Mileage doesn't. And so again, knowing that any number is only ever a proxy for the stress you're experiencing.
Yeah.
In that case, the best proxy is the time, not the miles. And it's actually the rare chance when quantifying things in miles is it's never going to be the more appropriate understanding of your training stress. I think there's some times where it's less harmful, but it's never more accurate necessarily. So I think that's sort of the context I would bring to it. I think that mileage-based training can really lead to overtraining and overdoing it. So athletes might push through fatigue to hit mileage goals even when the effort is too high. For instance, if I prescribed an athlete, like for instance, the 10-mile thing, for me, 10 miles maybe takes about an hour and 20 minutes. I can do a really low quality 10 miles that I'm just like fucking barely surviving. But if I'm just assigned 120 minutes, if I'm feeling tired, I'm less likely to engage in counterproductive stress. Because like it's accounting for the fact that I'm going slower.
Like running faster to get those miles done quicker.
Correct. Or just like it's not like it doesn't have a way of holding space for that fatigue, right? Like if I'm going to run 10 miles while fatigued or an hour and 20 minutes while fatigued, like the better way of controlling for that stress is the time-based training.
Right, because you won't be out there for
you won't be out there for as long, which becomes counterproductive when you're fatigued, depending. It doesn't account for terrain and conditions, right? Like a slow technical run can take much longer than a smooth road run of the same distance. And particularly with trail and ultra athletes, we want to be able to quantify the additional strain and stress of that technicality and vert. And I think that another one that sometimes I want to rein athletes in on is like the snow trail running, because that can leave, like, at a certain point, walking around in the snow is not the most productive use of not a lot of bang for your buck. So bear that in mind. And I think that training, it can encourage, I think it, just like with almost anything, but I think mileage particularly, it can encourage unhealthy volume chasing. Runners, time and time again, will fixate on that weekly mileage number rather than focusing on the effective training. Because unfortunately, the Strava graph doesn't say this was all productive. It'll give you the same little orange line, whether it was great training or garbage training. And so, unfortunately, mileage doesn't hold space for that variability. And it tends to encourage... It lumps garbage training in with more productive training. Garbage training I'm using to refer to like
just going for
being
those
outside
miles.
of being outside of the prescribed effort level and training past the point of productivity and ability to recover.
So what are some pros of training by time?
So, better for effort-based training. Time-based training naturally adjusts for terrain, weather, and fatigue levels. Again, like an hour-long run, a recovery effort, that's much more controlled than a 6-mile run at recovery effort. Like maybe that takes me 50 minutes, maybe it takes me an hour and 20 minutes. And those are really different runs, and that complexity isn't captured by the mileage. I also think it can be, as someone, with a busy schedule, being able to block out exactly how much time something is going to take on my calendar is huge for me. You know, back when I used to just be prescribed mileage, I'd be like, well, historically, this would take me somewhere between 120 minutes and 2 hours, depending on how I feel and what route I take. And so, I think it makes it harder for athletes to plan. It also, time-based training encourages consistency and sustainability, and it prevents the urge to just finish the miles at all costs, and therefore can reduce injury risk. It's also going to be more efficient for aerobic development. So long, slow runs on challenging terrain yield better endurance gains when they're based on time rather than distance. Again, accounting for the difficulty of terrain. Time is also more effective at preventing unnecessary fatigue. So, think about 2 athletes running for 90 minutes. They're going to experience similar training effects, even if their mileage differs. For instance, you and I have similar time training volume, but the mileage graph that we get at the end of the week is different. But I would argue that how productive the training is for us on any given week is more or less pretty similar.
Yeah, should be.
Yeah.
So I think there probably are some cons to training by time. We want to make sure people hear about those things before we wrap it up. Less specific for race pacing. So this is going to be tougher probably for some of our marathon runners out there. It's harder to estimate race day effort if you aren't also doing some of your training based on mileage. And I think sometimes this can also lead to cutting runs short. Like a runner aiming for a 2-hour run may stop short of hitting a key mileage threshold needed for confidence. So like if you, for example, are doing a 2-hour run, but you're training for a 20-miler and your 2-hour run's only gets you 12 miles,
Yeah.
you still have a 6-mile gap in competence that you're maybe not addressing if you don't have some runs based on mileage, some benchmarks based on mileage.
Yeah, for instance, if I have an athlete that's newer to running and maybe is more of a walk-run athlete, but they're training for a significant event, marathon, ultra-marathon, oftentimes I will have their key long run still be mileage-based so that I can assure we get to some percentage of the mileage that they are prescribed on race day.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
race day prescribed by mileage. So that's kind of one of the exceptions I make there.
And I think also time-based training requires a huge amount of trust and awareness around effort.
Yep.
And
It only
RPE.
works if you allocate your effort accordingly.
And some athletes really struggle with not being able to track concrete mileage. So again, that focus, where do we have that focus? Is it on the numbers or is it on how we feel?
Exactly. To which I would say, what matters more to you, a graph or effective training? And meditate on that.
Yeah.
If you need the graph to feel good about yourself, awesome. I'll beat you at every race for forever because I'll be here with my ugly little graph.
So which approach is best?
Depends on the athlete.
Yeah.
Obviously. So I think that if I had to, just flip if I, gun to my head, I have to pick time-based training. However, again, we discussed the specific use cases that make toggling between those approaches more effective for the individual. And again, talking about the long run, talking about any aspect of this, it should be really individuated. And I would just say that the challenge I would present people with is if you feel attached to the mileage, if you feel if you are a Zoe, don't be a Zoe. If you feel don't take my volume away from me, don't take my big shiny round numbers away from me, I think that person might be the person who most needs to move to time-based training to really get back in touch with productive versus unproductive rather than the framework of needing the number, which is only ever, again, a proxy, tying it all together in the conclusion. We love it. She's a writer. She's doing it. Bring it all back together. The better proxy for what you're experiencing is that time.
Beginners and busy runners, we tend to see them having more consistency in their training and avoiding unnecessary fatigue when they're using time-based training. Yep. Experienced runners with race-specific goals, sometimes a mix of mileage, benchmarks, and time-based training can be ideal. Depends on the individual. Might use a combination of both things. Trail and ultra runners, time-based training is often the most effective just due to that variability in terrain and effort demands. So how do we track those stresses? Time. Road runners aiming for PRs, probably going to have some mileage-based training in there, especially around specific workouts. And then we can, kind of what I'm describing there is a compromised approach around everything. Mileage can be used for key workouts, long runs, interval sessions, depending on the athlete's goals. And time could be used for easy aerobic runs to balance the workload and to manage, stress overall. I don't think there's any best approach. It kind of just depends on who the athlete is in front of you, and then what combination of the tools you want to apply to help them get to where they want to go.
Where are they? Where do they want to go? Who are they?
Well, cool. Hope you
Thank you for joining us on a podcast with no definite answers. Enjoy.
Like every podcast.
We asked 20 questions and answered none of them because it's all complicated and you're a lovely snowflake individual.
Send us your questions. We'd love to hear from you.
We'd love to not answer them.
microcosmcoaching@gmail.com. Find us on Instagram, microcosmcoaching, and on the internet, microcosm-coaching.com. We'll see you guys next week.